December 18, 1982, and Woodfield Mall in Schaumburg, Illinois, was packed with holiday shoppers just 1 week before Christmas. The massive 3-level shopping center bustling with thousands of people browsing stores and seeking gifts. Woodfield was one of the largest malls in the United States, with over 2 million square feet of retail space, multiple anchor stores, and a central atrium featuring a towering Christmas tree surrounded by elaborate holiday displays. Benjamin Knox was 5 years old that Saturday afternoon, a boy with distinctive jet black hair styled in a bowl cut, pale blue eyes, and a small gap between his 2 front teeth that appeared when he smiled. He wore dark gray wool slacks with suspenders, a burgundy turtleneck sweater, black leather dress shoes that his mother had insisted he wear for the Christmas photos they'd planned, and he carried a small toy race car in his pocket. Benjamin had come to the mall with his mother, Caroline Knox, a legal secretary who was shopping for gifts, and had scheduled professional Christmas photos for 3 p.m. at the portrait studio on the 2nd level. At approximately 2:45 p.m., Carolyn and Benjamin were on the 1st floor browsing at Marshall Field's department store, looking at toys in the children's section while they had time before the photo appointment. The toy department was crowded with parents and children, with multiple aisles of displays featuring action figures, board games, and electronic toys, and holiday music played over the store's sound system. Caroline was examining a potential gift for Benjamin's older sister, while Benjamin stood beside her looking at toy cars displayed on a shelf at his eye level, and she could see him in her peripheral vision. At 2:48 p.m., a store employee approached Caroline asking if she needed help finding anything, and Caroline turned to answer the question, a conversation that lasted approximately 15 to 20 seconds. When Caroline turned back expecting to see Benjamin examining the toy cars, he was no longer standing beside her, and the aisle where he'd been was empty except for other shoppers moving through the department. Caroline called Benjamin's name and checked both directions of the aisle, thinking he'd wandered to look at toys in the next row, and she felt annoyance rather than immediate panic. But Benjamin didn't respond to her calls, and within 30 seconds Caroline was walking quickly through the toy department, checking every aisle and calling his name with increasing urgency. Store employees joined the search within 2 minutes, checking the entire children's department and making announcements asking Benjamin Knox to come to the customer service desk. By 2:55 p.m., mall security had been alerted that a 5-year-old boy was missing from Marshall Fields, and guards were dispatched to monitor exits while a systematic search of the massive mall began. In approximately 15 to 20 seconds, while his mother answered a store employee's question 5 feet away, 5-year-old Benjamin Knox vanished from a crowded department store without anyone seeing where he went. If you want to hear how this little boy was finally identified 4 decades later in shocking circumstances, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue. Schaumburg police arrived at 3:10 p.m., and Detective Robert Chen immediately coordinated a lockdown of Woodfield Mall, with all exits monitored, though 15 minutes had passed since Benjamin's disappearance. The toy department at Marshall Fields was examined thoroughly, and investigators interviewed employees and shoppers who'd been in the area, but nobody recalled seeing Benjamin leave or anyone leading him away. One customer mentioned seeing a woman bending down talking to a young boy near the toy cars around 2:48 p.m., but couldn't provide a detailed description beyond a woman in dark clothing with short hair. This vague witness account became the initial lead, suggesting someone had approached Benjamin while Caroline's attention was diverted, and had convinced him to walk away with her during those critical seconds. Caroline was interviewed extensively about Benjamin's personality and whether he would go with a stranger, and she insisted he'd been taught about stranger danger, but was a trusting child who might follow someone claiming to help him find his mother. The mall's security camera system in 1982 was limited, with cameras only at main entrances and some storefronts, but not in department store aisles where Benjamin had disappeared. Footage from cameras near Marshall Field's exits was reviewed, but the crowds were so dense that identifying individual children among hundreds of shoppers proved nearly impossible. Bloodhounds were brought to the mall by 4 p.m. and given Benjamin's scent from his jacket in Caroline's car, and the dogs tracked from the toy department toward the mall's south parking garage before losing the trail. The fact that the scent ended at the parking garage suggested Benjamin had been placed in a vehicle, and investigators began the massive task of trying to identify vehicles that had left the garage between 2:50 and 3:30 p.m. By evening, over 100 law enforcement officers were searching Woodfield Mall, checking every store, storage room, and maintenance area, but there was no trace of Benjamin anywhere in the massive complex. The parking garage where the bloodhounds had lost Benjamin's scent became a focal point of investigation, and detectives interviewed parking attendants about vehicles that had exited during the critical time frame. But the garage served thousands of shoppers daily, especially during the Christmas season, and attendants couldn't recall specific vehicles or anything unusual about cars leaving around 3 p.m. on a busy Saturday. FBI was contacted by 6 p.m., given the potential for kidnapping, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Chicago field office with resources and expertise from similar cases involving child abductions from public places. Agent Wells interviewed Caroline extensively about her life and relationships, looking for anyone who might have motive to take Benjamin, but Caroline was a single mother with no custody disputes or concerning ex-partners. Benjamin's biological father had died in a construction accident when Benjamin was 2 years old, and Caroline had no current romantic relationships or conflicts with anyone who would want to harm her by taking her son. The case generated intense media coverage across Illinois and neighboring states, with Benjamin's photo appearing on television showing his distinctive bowl-cut black hair and gap-toothed smile. The burgundy turtleneck and gray wool slacks with suspenders became key identifying features, and Caroline provided detailed descriptions, hoping someone would recognize the distinctive outfit. Tips flooded in from people claiming to have seen Benjamin at various locations, but every reported sighting was investigated and found to be other dark-haired boys with similar features. Detective Chen focused investigation on the store employee who'd approached Caroline with the question that had distracted her, wondering if this had been a deliberate tactic to create an opportunity for an accomplice to take Benjamin. But the employee was a 23-year-old college student working part-time during the holidays, and she had no criminal history or connection to anyone suspicious, and she was cleared after thorough investigation. The theory emerged that someone had been watching Caroline and Benjamin, had seen the mother distracted, and had approached the child with some story about helping him find his mother or showing him something interesting. A 5-year-old in a crowded store might have trusted an adult who seemed authoritative and kind, especially if the person claimed to know where his mother was or offered to help reunite them. By late December, the intensive search had been scaled back after 10 days produced no trace of Benjamin, despite extensive investigation, and the Knox family faced Christmas without answers about what had happened. Caroline quit her job as a legal secretary and devoted herself to searching for Benjamin, distributing flyers throughout Illinois, and appearing on local television programs keeping the case in public consciousness. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in 1983, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips. But as with everything else, each lead was investigated and found to be mistaken identity or well-meaning, but inaccurate information. One tip that seemed promising came from a woman in Wisconsin who reported that her neighbor had suddenly acquired a young son in January 1983, claiming she'd adopted the child privately. The neighbor was identified as Dorothy Hartman, a 58-year-old retired teacher who lived alone, and she'd introduced the boy she was calling Andrew to neighbors in early January. FBI agents investigated Hartman and questioned her about Andrew's background, and she provided adoption documents that appeared legitimate, though agents noted the paperwork seemed unusually minimal for a legal adoption. Andrew was interviewed carefully by social workers, and the 5-year-old seemed happy and well cared for, but he had no memories of life before living with Dorothy, which the woman claimed was normal for a child adopted at such a young age. DNA testing wasn't widely available in 1983, so investigators had to rely on physical identification, and while Andrew had dark hair, his eyes were brown rather than blue, and he didn't have the gap between his front teeth. Caroline was brought to Wisconsin to see Andrew, and while the child had some similarities to Benjamin, she couldn't definitively identify him as her son, and the eye color difference was significant. Without concrete evidence that Andrew was Benjamin, and with Dorothy having apparently legitimate adoption paperwork, authorities reluctantly concluded they couldn't prove the child was the missing Illinois boy. The Wisconsin lead eventually went cold when further investigation seemed to support Dorothy's adoption story, though Caroline always wondered if that had been Benjamin, and the system had failed to bring him home. By 1990, the case had essentially gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Benjamin Knox became another child who'd vanished from a crowded shopping mall despite his mother being just feet away. The years accumulated with agonizing slowness for Caroline Knox, with 1982 becoming 2000 and then 2010, and Benjamin's room remained exactly as it had been, filled with toy cars and books that a 5-year-old had loved. Age progression photos were created showing what Benjamin might look like at 10, 15, 25, 35, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases as technology advanced over the decades. Caroline never remarried or had other children, unable to move forward from December 18, 1982, when she'd turned away for 15 seconds and had lost her son forever in a department store. She became an advocate for missing children, working with organizations to improve security at shopping malls and pushing for comprehensive surveillance camera systems at retail locations, channeling her grief into activism. Her advocacy helped pass legislation in Illinois, requiring shopping centers above a certain size to have extensive camera coverage and mandatory protocols for immediately locking down facilities when children went missing. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2015, and he was troubled by the Wisconsin lead from 1983 that had never been fully resolved, and he wondered what had happened to the boy called Andrew, who'd been with Dorothy Hartman. Morrison used modern databases to try tracking Dorothy Hartman and Andrew, but they'd effectively vanished after 1985, with no social security records, driver's licenses, or paper trail indicating where they'd gone, or what names they might be using. By 2020, Benjamin would have been 43 years old, and Caroline, now 71 and in declining health, held memorial services each December 18th at Woodfield Mall near where Marshall Fields had been located. The portrait studio where Benjamin had been scheduled for Christmas photos at 3 p.m. that day had long since closed, but Caroline would stand near that second-level location and remember the appointment they'd never made. True crime podcasts rediscovered Benjamin's case in the early 2020s, and several shows featured detailed episodes about the shopping mall disappearance and the mysterious Wisconsin adoption that had never been properly investigated. In September 2024, a man named Andrew Mitchell living in Oregon died unexpectedly from a heart attack at age 47, and during a state settlement, his attorney discovered documents that raised disturbing questions about his origins. Among Andrew's possessions were old photographs showing him as a young child, with a woman who wasn't his known adoptive mother, and handwritten notes suggesting his early childhood history might have been fabricated. Most significantly, Andrew's birth certificate had inconsistencies that the attorney recognized as potential fraud, and there was no documentation of his existence before 1983, when he would have been approximately 6 years old. Andrew's widow, Sarah Mitchell, was shocked by these discoveries and contacted authorities in Oregon, explaining that her late husband had always been vague about his early childhood and had no contact with biological family. Andrew said he was adopted as a baby by Dorothy Hartman, but he had no memories of it and no documentation. Sarah explained. He'd tried to find records over the years, but everything seemed to lead to dead ends. Oregon authorities contacted Illinois State Police about the findings, and Detective Sarah Chen from the Cold Case Unit immediately recognized potential connections to Benjamin Knox's disappearance. Chen obtained a court order to exhume Andrew Mitchell's body for DNA comparison, and she also tracked down what had happened to Dorothy Hartman, who'd raised Andrew as her adopted son. Records showed that Dorothy Hartman had died in 1998 in Washington State, having moved there from Wisconsin in 1985, and she'd lived alone after Andrew left home at age 18. Among Dorothy's possessions that had been stored by distant relatives were boxes containing newspaper clippings about missing children from the 1980s, including multiple articles about Benjamin Knox's disappearance from Woodfield Mall. Most disturbing were Dorothy's journals from the early 1980s, where she'd written extensively about losing her teaching job due to budget cuts and feeling purposeless without children in her life. I deserve to have a child to raise. One entry from November 1982 read, "I would be a wonderful mother, better than these careless parents who don't watch their children properly and don't deserve them." The journals described visiting shopping malls during the holiday season and watching families, and there was an entry from December 18, 1982 that read, "Today I found him, a beautiful boy who needs someone who will truly appreciate him." Detective Chen requested DNA comparison between Andrew Mitchell's remains and Caroline Knox's genetic profile, and the analysis began in October 2024. The DNA analysis took 12 weeks due to the condition of Andrew Mitchell's remains, and when results came back in January 2025, they showed a 99.94% probability that Andrew Mitchell was biologically Benjamin Knox. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the cold case community and made international headlines. Benjamin Knox had been found 42 years after his disappearance, though tragically he died just months before being identified. Caroline Knox, now 73 and in fragile health, received the call from Detective Chen on a cold January morning, learning that her son had been alive for 41 years, before dying suddenly in Oregon. "Benjamin was alive all that time," Caroline sobbed. "He lived an entire life as Andrew Mitchell, and I was searching for him while he was in Oregon, not knowing who he really was. And now he's gone and I'll never get to talk to him." The revelation was equally devastating for Sarah Mitchell, who had to accept that her late husband had been a kidnapped child, and that his entire understanding of his identity and origins had been based on Dorothy Hartman's crime. Andrew struggled his whole life with feeling like something was missing, Sarah told investigators. He had these vague memories that didn't match what Dorothy told him, and he always felt disconnected from his supposed past. And now I know why. Detective Chen's investigation confirmed that Dorothy Hartman had been at Woodfield Mall on December 18, 1982, and had taken Benjamin during the brief seconds when Caroline had been distracted by a store employee. Dorothy's journals revealed she'd been planning to take a child for weeks, visiting multiple shopping malls during the Christmas season, and watching for opportunities when parents were distracted by shopping or conversations. When she'd seen Caroline turn to speak with the employee, Dorothy had approached Benjamin, told him his mother had sent her to bring him to the Christmas photo appointment, and had walked him quickly out of the store before anyone noticed. A 5-year-old who'd been expecting to go to photos would have trusted an adult claiming his mother had sent her, especially in the confusion and crowds of a busy department store during the holidays. Dorothy had taken Benjamin to her car in the parking garage, and she'd driven immediately to Wisconsin, arriving at her home by evening and beginning the process of convincing the child she was his adoptive grandmother. The adoption paperwork she'd shown FBI agents in 1983 had been sophisticated forgeries, good enough to pass initial scrutiny, but not thorough forensic examination that wasn't done at the time. Dorothy had changed Benjamin's eye color in her description to authorities, claiming Andrew had brown eyes when Benjamin's were actually blue, a deliberate lie to throw off investigators comparing the child to missing persons reports. The gap between Benjamin's front teeth had closed naturally as he'd grown, eliminating another distinctive identifying feature, and the bowl-cut hairstyle had been changed immediately after the abduction. Over time, Dorothy had convinced Benjamin that his memories of life before her were dreams or stories he'd imagined, and as a young child he'd eventually accepted her version of reality. Dorothy had moved from Wisconsin to Washington in 1985, possibly because she feared the Wisconsin investigation might eventually connect Andrew to Benjamin, and she'd isolated herself to prevent questions. Andrew had left Dorothy's home at 18 and had moved to Oregon for college, and he'd built a successful life as a software engineer, married Sarah, and had 2 children who were now teenagers. Caroline was shown photos and videos of Andrew throughout his life, seeing her son as a teenager, young man and adult, witnessing all the years she'd missed because of Dorothy Hartman's crime. "He looked happy," Caroline said through tears. "He had a good life with a wife and children, and I'm grateful for that. But I'll never stop grieving that I wasn't part of it, that Dorothy stole 42 years we could have had together." Sarah arranged for Caroline to meet Andrew's children, Caroline's biological grandchildren who'd never known they had a grandmother in Illinois searching for their father. The teenagers were shocked to learn their father's true identity, and they spent hours with Caroline looking at photos of Benjamin as a young child and hearing stories about who he'd been before the abduction. "Dad always said something felt incomplete about his past," Andrew's daughter told Caroline. "And now we understand why. He was missing you and the life he should have had, even though he couldn't consciously remember it." The fact that Andrew had died just months before being identified was a cruel twist, and Caroline struggled with the reality that she'd come so close to potentially reuniting with her son if he'd lived just a few months longer. Carolyn traveled to Oregon in February 2025 to visit Andrew's grave, and finally say goodbye to the son she'd lost at a shopping mall 42 years earlier and had never stopped searching for. Sarah accompanied Caroline to the cemetery, and the 2 women stood together at Andrew's headstone, which would soon be updated to include his birth name, Andrew Benjamin Mitchell Knox, 1977 to 2024, beloved husband and father, found his way home. Caroline brought the burgundy turtleneck sweater Benjamin had worn the day he disappeared, preserved for 42 years in her closet, and she placed it on his grave as a tangible connection to the 5-year-old he'd been. "I'm sorry I looked away," Caroline whispered to the headstone. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you from that woman, and I'm sorry you lived your whole life not knowing who you really were, or that I was searching for you every single day." Sarah shared videos and photos of Andrew's life with Caroline, showing her the wedding, the births of his children, career milestones, and family vacations that documented the decades Caroline had missed. "He was a wonderful father," Sarah told Caroline. "He was patient and kind and always made time for our kids. And I think maybe that came from some deep need to give them the stable childhood he felt was somehow incomplete in his own past." Caroline met regularly with her grandchildren over the following months, building relationships with the teenagers and sharing stories about their father's early childhood that they'd never known existed. Andrew's son, who was 16, bore a striking resemblance to Benjamin at 5, with the same dark hair and pale blue eyes, and Caroline found bittersweet comfort in seeing her son's features continued in the next generation. The case brought renewed international attention to children abducted and raised under false identities, and it emphasized the importance of DNA databases in solving decades-old mysteries, even when victims have died. Illinois updated missing persons protocols in 2025, requiring that DNA from all long-term missing children be uploaded to genealogical databases to enable identification, even if the missing person never personally submits DNA. Caroline established the Benjamin Knox Foundation to support families of missing children and to fund DNA testing and genealogical research that could identify people who'd been abducted as children, but don't know their true origins. Within its first year, the foundation facilitated 9 identifications of missing persons, including 3 who were deceased like Benjamin and 6 who were found alive and reunited with biological families. Woodfield Mall installed a permanent memorial near the former Marshall Field's location with photos of Benjamin as a child and as Andrew Mitchell, explaining the case and emphasizing the importance of vigilance. The memorial includes the text, "Benjamin Knox, taken 1982, identified 2025, though found too late for reunion. His story brings others home," transforming the site of tragedy into a symbol of hope. Dorothy Hartman's name became synonymous with child predators who stalk shopping malls, and her journals were studied by FBI behavioral analysts to understand how such criminals think and operate. The case inspired shopping centers across the country to enhance security measures, including more comprehensive surveillance systems and better training for staff on recognizing potential abduction scenarios. Sarah wrote a book about Andrew's life and the discovery of his true identity after his death, and the memoir included Caroline's perspective on the 42 years of searching that ended bittersweet. "Andrew deserved to know he was Benjamin," Sarah wrote. "He deserved to meet his mother and learn about the man who'd been his father before Dorothy stole him, and I'll always grieve that he died without that knowledge." Caroline lived to see Benjamin's case solved and to establish meaningful relationships with his children, though she died in 2027 at age 75, carrying the pain of having found her son 2 years too late. Her obituary mentioned that she was preceded in death by her son Benjamin, found 42 years after his abduction, but identified too late for the reunion she'd spent a lifetime hoping for. The story of Benjamin Knox, taken at age 5 from an Illinois shopping mall and identified 42 years later as Andrew Mitchell through DNA after his death, stands as one of the most bittersweet missing persons resolutions. It proves that DNA technology can solve even the oldest cases and provide answers to families, though sometimes those answers come with the heartbreak of missed opportunities for reunion. And it demonstrates that children abducted young and raised under false identities may live entire lives without knowing their true origins, making DNA databases crucial for eventual identification. The burgundy turtleneck sweater Caroline had kept for 42 years was eventually given to Andrew's children, who keep it displayed in their home as a connection to the grandfather they never met and the uncle they didn't know existed. Andrew's daughter told reporters that learning about her father's true identity changed how she understood him, explaining quirks and feelings of disconnection he'd expressed throughout his life. "Dad used to say he felt like he was searching for something but didn't know what," she explained. "And now I understand he was searching for himself, for the truth about who he was, and it breaks my heart that he never found it." The case reminds us that 5-year-olds should be safe in shopping malls with their parents, that 15 seconds of distraction is all an abductor needs, and that some reunions come too late but still matter. Caroline's decades of searching weren't in vain, because her persistence and the DNA she provided enabled Benjamin's identification even after his death, giving his children knowledge about their heritage and bringing some measure of closure. And in Schaumburg, Illinois, where a little boy in a burgundy turtleneck once stood looking at toy cars before vanishing, his story lives on as both tragedy and testament to a mother's unending love. The toy race car Benjamin had carried in his pocket that December day was never found, but his children keep a vintage race car from the 1980s in their home, as a symbol of the 5-year-old their father had been.